last month, and then one next month, and the last one's in May. Right? Yes. So come back for those. Lots of good topics. Tonight, really excited about our speaker for tonight. But before I introduce her, I want to talk to you about our second big event that the EQC puts on is the Shoreview Green Community Awards, where you can nominate yourself or a neighbor, other community members, business owners, churches, schools, if they've taken efforts to put in environmentally green projects, anything to do with energy conservation, water conservation, native plants, things like that, anything to green up our community. We want to showcase those projects and recognize people for their efforts. So you can find that application online, submit that, and basically anyone you nominate will get an award. So we want to recognize all these good projects and the efforts that people are putting in. So our speaker tonight, as I mentioned, is the second of our 4 series. We, as the EQC, the Environmental Quality Commission, we like to kind of pick hot topics that are out there right now, things that are in the news, things that we want to educate our residents about and learn more about ourselves. And last month we had 2 people from MnDOT here talking about smart salting for safe roads, was what it was called. So you can catch that online if you weren't able to be here last month. And this one will be online too, if you want to follow up afterwards or pass it on to anybody. So our speaker tonight is Nissa Tupper. And Nissa works as I have to read this because it's really long, as a program planner for the Minnesota Climate and Health Program for the Minnesota Department of Health. The Minnesota Climate and Health Program works to understand the health impacts of climate change and prepare the public for those risks. Nissa joined the Department of Health in 2016. Prior to that, she worked in communications and also as a landscape architect. So she's bringing in kind of different areas of expertise and able to connect with her contacts from these different organizations to develop processes and tools to allow the public to work with and deal with these climate change issues that she'll talk about. With that, I will hand it over to Nissa.
All right, so I've been told to speak in the mic, and I think we have about an hour here today, and I am just thrilled at the turnout. So thank you, everybody, for taking part of your evening to be here today and for welcoming me to Shoreview. So I work in downtown St. Paul, live in Mendota Heights, and it's nice to get in this neck of the woods of the Twin Cities. Let's see. I will navigate to my PowerPoint here. Okay, so as Paige mentioned, I'm a Climate and Health Program Manager at the Minnesota Department of Health. And how many of you, just raise of hands, were familiar with the Climate and Health Program at the State Department? 0. That's why we do these things. So we've been around since 2009, and we are a federally funded program through the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And so you'll see we're one of the dark blue states. There are a number of states and a couple of cities who are funded through the CDC. And it's called a Climate Ready States and Cities Initiative. And it's really great because it allows us to tap into a network of other states and cities who are doing similar work so we can learn from each other, build efficiencies in our tools and processes. And it also allows us to become a leader on these issues for the Midwest. So it's a really great opportunity for us. So today I'm going to cover some background context that I think are important for us as we talk about climate and health issues. What do we mean by health? What are the climate changes that we're seeing in Minnesota? And how are those linked to health impacts here at home? Why is this a priority for the Minnesota Department of Health, looking at how we protect and maintain the health of Minnesotans across the state? And then ending with action, because there are all things we can do as individuals and as communities to make more resilient communities in the face of climate change, especially from a health perspective. So I always find it helpful to ground ourselves in stories when we're talking about something like climate change, because it can tend to be really abstract and something that's out there happening. But once we start to share stories, I feel like it really makes it real for us, and it allows us to connect better on the impacts that we're seeing here at home. So if you can think a little bit about how climate change is impacting your life, perhaps through a health perspective, perhaps not, or the lives of people you know here in your community. and then we'll come around with the mic just to get a few ideas. But I can share a couple from my perspective. So this is a picture of our family dog. Her name is Bean. She's a Springer Spaniel, and she's good at looking cute. So we had a dog prior to Bean. About 10 years ago, and many of you are probably familiar with Frontline. You put it on your pets so that they don't have ticks attached to them, and hopefully less or zero transmission of things like little diseases that some ticks can carry. So we used to do that with our old dog, and we'd always start in May and then end in September, so it aligned with when we were outside during the frost-free season, and we never had to put it on past September. So 2 years ago in October, we were sitting watching a movie, petting the dog, and then we reached down and pulled a tick off of her, and I was shocked. We hadn't been camping since the end of August. We hadn't been to the dog park or any really wooded areas in our suburban town, and yet she still had a tick on her, and it was October. It's like, where did this come from? We had never had to think about ticks in our area before. It always happened with camping up north. And so that I'll talk a little bit about what we call vector-borne disease in some further slides, but that made me think like, wow, you know, we haven't had the frost yet. That was a particularly extended frost-free season. And, you know, do we need to change how we behave and how we protect our pets and ourselves from things like ticks and some of the diseases they can carry? The other thing that's hit home for me recently is how we grow food. So I grew up in Owatonna, and my family always had a really large garden. Rely on my dad for all the gardening advice, and his sage advice was always, don't ever put your vegetables out in the garden until the end of May, because we're going to get a frost. It's going to kill your plants. And so, you know, I would say that to my friends, and really held by that. And they'd put their plants out Mother's Day weekend, and either have to protect them. But the last couple of years, they've gotten by and have been eating those delicious tomatoes and cucumbers and things weeks earlier than me, because I waited until the very end of May. And there is research that is starting to quantify the length of our frost-free season, and we're seeing about 2 weeks extended period of that time, which does impact how long you can grow vegetables and things like that here. It also impacts some other things like the types of things that survive here. So those are just a couple of my observations of how I've noticed it impacting my life in different ways. And I'm wondering if a couple people can just share some really brief anecdotes about what you're seeing in your life. Great. And we'll pass around a mic so that people who are watching this can hear as well.
Two things in my life. I lived just off the south end of Turtle Lake, and we had a long dry spell, and the extended ice-free season exacerbated the problem because we had a lot more evaporation than we'd had in previous years. The other thing is it messes up my downhill skiing season because it's just too warm.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, the warming winters and how that impacts how we get outdoors. Yep. Thanks for sharing. Does anyone else?
There's a darker side to the longer growing season, and that perennial crops like apples and grapes flush early and frost off.
Yep.
In some places now, it's gotten to be where if you don't have some frost control strategy, a decade ago nobody bought frost control equipment, and it's really common now.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, the crops get frosted off, and you don't have a crop.
Yep, that's a really good point. It's disrupting our agriculture cycle in many ways. Yep. Does anybody else want to share anything? Okay, we can move on. And we'll have time for questions at the end as well. And I'll have materials in my card available. So this, whoops. I don't know if I'll get this video clip to work. I don't think we have sound, but I just think this is a helpful way to understand and ground ourselves in the difference between weather and climate. So this is a video that you can go online if you search weather and climate on YouTube. Basically, it's explaining that you need to be watching the man walking the dog when you're thinking about long-term trends. Sometimes people want to focus on the weather when we're thinking about climate change, what happened last year, what happened next year, and that's the dog that's being watched, so you'll have these spikes up and down, but you want to be watching the man and the route that's happening and that trend line over time. So it's a cute video if you can go online and watch it. the fun way to explain it to people. Because in Minnesota, we love to talk about the weather, what it was like last year or the year before. And we really want to encourage people to think about weather in terms of, the weeks and months and climate change. And when we look at trends and how that can impact our health and our infrastructure, we look at long-term trends over 20 or 30 years. So that'll come into play as I show some charts and graphs too, so if you think about those trend lines. So from the Department of Health, we're really dedicated to understanding the links between climate change and health and understanding what that means here in Minnesota. So here in Minnesota, we're seeing two particular main changes that we're tracking with the DNR, Department of Climatology. So rise in temperature and change in precipitation. And those things are causing changes in our air, our weather, our water, and our ecosystems. And those we call climate hazards. And so I'll just walk through those two buckets to show you how that plays out here in Minnesota. So in terms of rising temperatures, this chart here shows you our annual average temperature over time. So it's from the last about 120 years, and it's split into two 60-year time frames. So over 1895 to 1959, we saw about 0.2 degree increase per decade in annual average temperatures. And in 1960 to 2016, we've seen that increase to 0.5 degree increase per decade. And so the trend line, if you think of the man walking the dog, is the red dot. The dog each year are the spikes. And so we're seeing that trend line indicate up. And sometimes people will say, well, 0.5 degrees, that doesn't seem like a very big deal. But if you want to compare how the earth regulates itself to how your body regulates itself, it's very similar at a simplistic level. We like to stay within a pretty tight range. So if you think about when you get sick and your temperature starts to increase a little bit, you start to feel off, you move a little bit slower, it increases more, you can't function the way that you were supposed to. It's the same way with our ecosystems. They like to stay within a certain range. And so you start to see smaller increases, and that can have an impact. So in terms of how this plays out throughout the state, there are variations, which are interesting to look at and important to understand. So you'll see, again, annual average temperature is increasing, and we see that increasing more in the northern part of the state than the southern part of the state. And what's really driving the annual average increases are warmer winters. So that's the winter lows, the one in the middle. So because of our warmer winters, we're having less snow and more rain, particularly in the northern part of the state. And in terms of summer highs, we're seeing a slight increase in the northern part of the state, but we're actually seeing a slight dip in the middle and southern part of the state. So the rising winter temperatures are causing shifts in our ecosystems and environmental changes. Many of you are probably familiar with the plant hardiness zones. These are put out by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they are based on the average annual minimum winter temperature over a 30-year period. And each of those zones represents a 10-degree Fahrenheit increment of minimum temperature. And so the map on the left-hand side is from 1990, and the map on the right-hand side is 2015. And you can see Minnesota, in 1990, we were primarily Zone 3 and Zone 4. And by 2015, we've seen Zone 5 start to push up into the bottom part of the state. We're predominantly Zone 4 now with Zone 3 inching out towards the top. So that changes the types of plants that will survive well here, but it also changes the whole ecosystem of the insects, the animals that make that their home and survive on those plants as well. So the other bucket was in terms of precipitation changes. So one of the things in terms of precipitation changes is the annual average precipitation. So these charts mirror the temperature charts, so it's over the last 120 years. Over the first 60-year portion from 1895 to 1959, we saw an actual decrease of about negative 0.2 inches per decade, and that's primarily a reflection of the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s. From 1960 to 2016, we're seeing more of an upward trend to an increase of about half an inch per decade. In addition to the increase of annual average amounts, we're also seeing that the character of our precipitation is changing, which is really what's getting a lot of attention these days. So this timeline charts the number of mega rain events that have happened since 1860. The DNR keeps track of these, and they're categorized by 6 inches of rainfall that covers more than 1,000 square miles, so these are pretty big storms. And 7 of the 15 of these mega rain events have occurred just since 2002, so we're seeing a cluster of those recently, and that's having some large impacts across the state. So that's a really high-level background on climate changes here in Minnesota. I have lots of resources to share to expand on those if people are interested. But I also want to talk a little bit about, in general, what impacts our health before I talk about how climate and health are linked. Quite often, when we think about health, we automatically think about healthcare. And healthcare plays a really important role in maintaining our quality of life and our health. But we know that it's not the only factor that contributes to our health. This chart I find really telling. It's something that's been reaffirmed over the years, and it charts countries by life expectancy, which are the blue bars. And the orange line on top is the annual gross domestic product spent on health care. And so the US, we're at 79 years with life expectancy, yet we spend the most out of all of the countries on our health care. And that puts about 34 countries spending much less than us with better longevity outcomes. So we know it's not just how much we spend on healthcare that impacts our health and well-being. Yes, yep. She asked if we're lumping men and women together in that 79 years, yes. So from the public health perspective, we want people to think about all these things that impact our health that we call the social determinants of health. So starting from the top and going counterclockwise, about 10% of our health is influenced by our genes and biology, really things that we can't change, like our age, our history, our gender. About 10% is our physical environment, the quality of air that we breathe, the quality of water that we're able to drink. About 10% is access to clinical care. And then a larger portion of that, 30%, is our health behaviors, what type of food we choose to eat every day, how we choose to manage our stress, how we choose to stay healthy by exercising, those types of things. 40%, and it's pulled out, social and economic factors. And it's pulled out separately because it's the largest chunk, but it also is really the underpinnings for allowing access to make healthy choices, healthy behaviors, for allowing access to clinical care, and for allowing the ability to take advantage of a clean, healthy physical environment. So these are things like jobs and wages, having access to those, quality of life, quality of living, institutional racism and how that influences our access to certain things. And so altogether, we have a pretty complicated pie of what impacts our health, but a lot of these are also tied to climate change. And so from the Department of Health and from a climate change perspective, we really want people to ground themselves in the understanding that healthy communities are what create healthy people. It's about everything around us every day, where we live, work, and play, that really enables our ability to choose and access a healthy life. So in 2009, from a public health perspective, The Lancet, which is a public health journal, came out with a statement that climate change is the greatest global public health threat. This is the same year that our program started receiving funding from the CDC. And they said this not to be alarmist, but because for so long the climate change narrative has been embedded in things that really distance us from the conversation. It's about ice caps and polar bears. And we really need to reframe the conversation around health, because it does threaten the very things that we depend on for existence: our food, our water, our sense of security and safety. And so when we reframe it through the lens of health, it makes it real for us, and it allows us to have a much broader conversation about what we can do about it and how we can push resilience forward in order to take care of ourselves and also future generations. So now we'll dive into some of the specific health impacts for here in Minnesota. So looking at the diagram again, and I have handouts for people if you want to take some of these with you. So basically we studied the climate hazards for Minnesota and the direct and indirect health impacts, and we have a report that's on our website from 2015 that documents these. But in essence, all of these climate hazards are impacting health. The direct effects are things that happen as an immediate or short-term result of exposure to the climate hazard, like air pollution. An indirect effect is something that happens more long-term. These things are harder to quantify from a public health perspective. So, for example, flooding, a direct or immediate impact could be safety, flooding. An indirect impact could be respiratory ailments because of untreated mold that sits in your home from having a flooded basement that you weren't able to repair. So two general buckets of impacts from climate hazards. So I'll just have one slide on each of these to give you an idea. In terms of air pollution, the things that we're tracking from a public health perspective are ozone, pollen, and particulate matter, and we work pretty closely with a couple partners internally and also with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency on these. Direct impacts, things like causing or aggravating existing illnesses, respiratory illnesses, things like asthma. Indirect impacts, smog reducing visibility, reduced productivity at work or school. Those things are tied to things like asthma and allergies, which can really impact how you show up every day. And in terms of agriculture, degradation of crops or water bodies. As an example, the chart here shows the change in ragweed pollen season for our area from 1995 to 2015. In that time period, they documented an increase of 15 to about 25 days, depending on where you are in the state, of lengthening of that ragweed pollen season. In terms of extreme heat, many people, when you bring up extreme heat in Minnesota, it's kind of brushed off like, oh, we don't have extreme heat. That's something that happens in Arizona or Florida. But extreme heat is all relative. So we're used to being around certain temperatures, and we have had what are considered extreme heat waves, where we have prolonged periods of heat over several days, and when the nighttime temperature doesn't reduce enough to allow our bodies to cool off. We have had those in the past. As an example, in 2011, we had an extreme heat event and documented more than 1,200 emergency department visits, and we had 3 deaths. And extreme heat from a climatological standpoint isn't an immediate climate hazard threat because the average annual temperature increase is coming from winter low increases. But from a public health standpoint, it is a concern because impacts are completely preventable by modifying our behavior, not going outside for a run at noon when it's extremely hot out, or modifiable by our systems, making sure that our most vulnerable in our community have access to cooling centers or air conditioning, and being cognizant of how our systems and our behaviors are interacting during periods of extreme heat. In terms of flood and drought, like I briefly mentioned, some of the direct impacts of flood can include things like mental stress if you're dealing with flooded infrastructure in your home and you have to move, immediate threats like injury or drowning. It could impact water supply. Indirect effects, things like I mentioned, ailments from mold or contamination in your home or businesses, strain on essential services if roads are flooded and you can't access a hospital, the long-term impacts on community cohesion and well-being if you're losing safe and secure housing. In terms of drought, we didn't document direct impacts because it's really something that happens over a long period of time, and it's a really complex issue. So this has more indirect or long-term impacts linked to things like reduced water supply, in particular for those communities and individuals who rely on agriculture or the environment for sorry, I want to say environment for economic. There it is. And so the example I have here is the 2016 Waseca flood. We visited their community last year, and it really struck me. So they were a community that was struck 2 consecutive years by flood, and they were just recovering from the first flood, rebuilding, and getting the pieces put back together, and they were hit by a second flood. The terrain there is pretty flat. They're next to a river. FEMA was called in, and anecdotally, what was most distressing to hear is, they can rebuild the infrastructure and put the physical pieces back together, but the impact on the community is something that's a lot harder to measure, and the impacts there in terms of, how the kids were able to show up at school because of where they were or were not living, the impacts on community relationships and the policing and the social workers seem to be the most distressing for that community. So that's something that we're starting to pay more attention to in terms of when these extreme precipitation events happen, how long is support available, and what does that support look like for communities? And should we hold questions to the end, you think? Or is that okay? Okay, so we'll just cruise through this and then we'll take questions. The last one in terms of ecosystem threats. So this is all about things like diseases that could be carried by what we call vectors, like mosquitoes or ticks, and also harmful algal blooms, which are both complicated issues, but both are linked in some way, shape, or form to climate change. And that can include either the direct exposure and impact, like contracting something like Lyme's disease, or the indirect effects, where if you depend on the ability to go out into the environment and you experience financial strains because you can't do that anymore, either because you're sick or it's not an option. Those are things that can impact your health. So the 3 map series that you see up there are different points in time that show the distribution of Lyme disease cases by county of residence in Minnesota. So it goes from 1996 to 2013, and basically the more cases that are reported, the darker the blue. So over time, you can see how that is growing and spreading. Lyme's disease is a tricky thing for us to track because even how this chart notes, these cases are reported quite often by county of residence, and that doesn't necessarily mean that's where you contracted Lyme's. You could have been camping somewhere else, and then you go home and realize it and go to your local doctor. And there are lots of other factors that influence it, but overall, we are seeing a spread in things like Lyme's. So, one way that's helpful to start looking at these issues at a community scale and thinking about, how do we plan for these impacts? How do we even begin to understand who's most vulnerable in our community, and how do we plan for that? Is to think about vulnerabilities in kind of 2 buckets. One is the individual vulnerability bucket. This kind of corresponds with that 10%, if you think back to that pie chart of what impacts our health, and things that you can't necessarily change but we need to pay attention to, and societal things. And these are all things that are tied to broader policy decisions and the way we plan our communities that really have the greatest opportunity for impact. So taking a look at both of these, we have information in terms of each climate hazard and specific populations that are vulnerable for each. I've lumped them together because they're quite often overlapping. So individual risk factors could be age, people older than 65 or children under 5. Older than 65, especially if you're living alone or don't have people checking up on you. Sometimes people don't want to evacuate if they live by themselves and have a pet and can't bring the pet to the shelter. So this is in terms to some of the extreme precipitation events. Children under 5, children can be some of our most resilient citizens, but they're also our most at risk because they depend on others for their care. So they in general tend to be one of the most at-risk groups for all of the climate hazards. People with an existing illness or disease. Climate change has been called kind of the great amplifier because it really adds and amplifies onto current risks that people are already experiencing. People with disability, race, ethnicity, that one really ties to environmental justice issues that really have impacted how especially communities of color are or can be exposed disproportionately to climate hazards and have less access to the tools that can make them more resilient. Gender sometimes can be a risk factor. For example, studies have shown from some of the extreme precipitation events like the flooding in Katrina that women were more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder than men. So in the societal bucket, the big areas where we can really make some changes are things like understanding where people are living and what those conditions are. So who's living alone? What does that look like? What are the social systems of support available? How are people receiving information? Do they speak English? Do they need to receive information in a different language in order to respond to threats? People living in poverty, who does and who doesn't have access to make repairs on their home if something happens. People who have livelihoods that rely on the outdoors, construction workers who are outside in the heat. What are the policies in place if we have an extreme heat event? People who are experiencing homelessness and don't have somewhere to cool off when they need to. Who has air conditioning, who doesn't. And at a community scale, community-wide, what kind of climate disasters have happened in the past? How likely are those to compound and keep happening? How economically dependent is the community on things that are being impacted by climate change? And then in terms of emergency plans, as I alluded to with the Wasika story, do the emergency plans address mental and behavioral health? Those are becoming more and more of a pressing issue. So climate change, like I said, has been noted as a powerful risk amplifier. And we know that everybody will be impacted by climate change, but some people will be impacted more than others. And so we like to focus our efforts on people-focused planning and really looking at who's most at risk and trying to push forward policies that focus on health equity and making sure that no matter where you live, work, and learn and play, you have the tools available to make sure that you're resilient against some of these things. Because when we take care of those who are most at risk and meet their needs, we inherently take care of everybody else. So from a glass half full perspective, The Lancet came out in 2015 with a little bit different tone and said tackling climate change could be the greatest global health opportunity of the 21st century. And I've been really encouraged by a lot of the local comprehensive planning efforts and just the new partnerships that are being built between government institutions, different levels of planning to figure out how do we build bridges and pool resources and come together to focus on pushing climate and health equity and building resilience for our communities in new ways. I think it's a really great opportunity for new kinds of partnerships and new kinds of thinking. So we never want to leave a conversation without action steps to do something. So we have kind of three big things, categories or buckets of action. And these are all related to climate resilience in terms of reducing future harm and impacts of that. So the first one is energy production. That's one of the big three contributors to our climate change because our energy use really puts up a lot of greenhouse gases. And as individuals, so each of these has kind of an individual and a collective bucket, we can all do things like using less energy to heat or cool our house, changing out your light bulbs, reducing the waste stream. What's really going to make the biggest impact is if we look at the collective actions and come together as communities and look at policies for renewable energy and really getting ourselves supporting renewable energy choices. And when we're doing that, making sure, like from a health equity lens, asking questions about these policies, who has access to these and who doesn't, who's benefiting from these and who's not, who's at the table helping to make these decisions. I think that's really critical when you're looking at any of these types of policies. So keep that in mind as we look at the other two as well. And the second is transportation. That's the second big contributor to our changing climate. So as individuals, we can do things like lessen our dependence on fossil fuels and choose what they call active transportation modes, walking, biking, telecommuting when possible. Well, it's not active transportation, but it'll reduce how much you drive. Collectively, though, what kind of policies can we enact, and how can we plan our communities to make some of these choices the safest choices, the most accessible choices, the choices that people want to make. So is it feasible for people to bike to the grocery store to pick up dinner? If not, how do we change that? Do people feel safe walking around the community, walking to work? If not, how do we start to work on that? And what are the policies that can push us as a collective to have more transportation options, and how do we incentivize that? And the last one is agriculture. It takes a lot of energy to produce, process, and transport our food. So as individuals, the more that we can buy locally grown foods, eat fewer processed foods and less meat, and grow some of our own food, the more impact we can have. Collectively, taking those and thinking about the policies. So how, at a community level, are we incentivizing policies that allow us to grow local food? I saw that the city of Shoreview has beekeeping and chickens, so that's encouraging. And there's lots of really fun things that communities are doing in terms of community-supported agriculture or food forests and parks. And I think the opportunity is really ripe for us to think about our food system in new and sustainable ways. So our program, we try our best to share the latest information. If people are interested in staying in touch, we have a webpage. So it's health.mn.gov/climate change. We have lots of information on there. We also have a free newsletter. It doesn't come out that often, so it won't clog your email inbox, but we try to share the latest on local and national research, funding opportunities, trainings, job openings, just things to keep people in touch in what's happening in the world of climate and health. So please go to the website and sign up if you're interested. And I wanted to put a plug in. We just finished a big project. It's a training module series, and it basically is a series of hour-long deep dives on each of those topics, plus more that I just touched on. So we have one on Climate and Health 101, agriculture and food security, air quality, extreme heat, water quality, well-being, and vector-borne disease. And with each of those, we held a webinar for each, so there's a recording that you can listen to, there's a full PowerPoint presentation, and for those who don't have that time or want to take that deep dive, we've summarized the information into summary fact sheets, and I can pass some of those out as well, just to give the highlights on, from each of these climate hazard and health impact perspectives, what's happening in Minnesota, what are the top things we're concerned about, and then what are some of the action strategies that we can think about to move forward. So with that, I would love to take questions, and she'll come around with a microphone too.
Thank you. I have a question related to the funding. As I noticed, there was a cluster up in the north that got some of the funding. Is that because there's more going on up here? Or, I mean, I just was curious as to why that would look that way.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't go back. I was going to go back to it for reference. That has no correlation to what's happening in each region. At the very beginning of the funding cycle, it was a competitive funding cycle, so states and cities that were interested could apply. And I am not sure how the CDC determined their award criteria, but it's a funding cycle that's competitively renewed every 5 years. So we're in our second 5-year cycle right now. And it's been a great cohort for us to be part of, and I hope it continues. But
I'm a retired environmental engineer, and one of the things we do is design storm sewer systems.
okay.
And the plan is you design a storm sewer system for a 100-year return period. Our 100-year return period is getting larger and larger. Mm-hmm. And that's going to mean billions of dollars in redesign of storm sewer systems. Is anybody concerned about that? Obviously, the legislature isn't.
Yeah. Infrastructure is a big challenge. That's a little bit outside my scope, but I think, a big part of the issue is being able to quantify in a good way the projected risk. And so, you work with these numbers that are from the past, and those are obviously changing. And there's a scramble to understand the different scenarios of how things could move forward and to strategically allocate how do we invest our dollars to protect ourselves and mitigate against harm. I know a number of state agencies are working on that. MnDOT is working on that regionally. Met Council, they have a new section of their comprehensive planning cycle that's all about resilience, and some new tools that are coming out that look at infrastructure like the sewer and storm infrastructure, and how do we plan for that in a smart way over time. And I think it comes down a lot to scenario planning and working across these silos and coming together on it. So I don't have an answer for that, but I know people are working on that.
First of all, I want to say thank you for your presentation. You and your coworkers, congratulations on the work you're doing. I feel like I need to apologize to your generation and younger. My generation, we knew the science, we know the science. So many people are just denying it. It's absolutely disgusting and ridiculous. In fact, about half a dozen years ago or so, the 16 military intelligence groups, I didn't know there were 16 military intelligence groups, but there are, they got together and they decided what the biggest threat to the world was climate change. And here we are doing nothing, I should say doing nothing, but it's not done in a, cohesive manner. So I really appreciate the work you're doing. God bless you and your coworkers.
Thank you. And I must say, so last week we were at a grantee meeting in Atlanta that CDC hosted. So all the states here sent one or two people to come in person and learn from each other. And it was really encouraging because it really brought home for me that we're in a really good spot in Minnesota. I think we have support at a lot of levels, and there's a lot of great organizations that are pushing for this narrative to focus more on people here and to focus on resilience strategies. There are some states that can't even say climate change still. And so I think we're beyond that here in Minnesota, and we have a really great opportunity to capture that energy and not only talk about the science, but really capture the hearts of people and share the stories of what's happening and the impacts on people. I think that's a big driver behind decisions too, is these stories. And I know there are a lot of local efforts to capture those stories and kind of rise them up so that we all understand what's happening in our communities and across the state. So thank you.
From your perspective, what are some of those organizations that you think are having the greatest impact here in Minnesota, and how may we support them?
Oh, sure. So a couple that come top of mind, Climate Generation. So they're working to elevate the youth voice in this arena and educating teachers and getting information about climate and resilience and health into curriculum. They're doing a lot of really, really great work. So if you look up Climate Generation, I believe it used to be called the Will Steger Foundation. So he's still involved. I've seen from the faith community, the Interfaith Power and Light. They're doing a lot of great work. Healthcare professionals for healthy climate. It's a number of health professionals from nurses to MDs that are working to get climate and health part of the curriculum here in Minnesota and advocating for climate as a health issue and a driver behind the decisions we make. Trying to think of other organizations. I know there are lots. We have a page of partners and resources on our webpage too.
I should thank you also. I was remiss in not doing that. I was born in 1946, and I've seen cardinals and possums move into the state just in my lifetime. And I'm wondering if you have any idea when the yellow fever and malaria mosquitoes are going to arrive.
I don't. I don't. We do have whole departments that track things like that, but I don't. Well, thank you. I hope this was informative for people. I have a packet of information too that I'll kind of bring up here, and you can grab my card if you have more questions. But I really appreciate people coming out, and I hope this is just part of your journey in building resilience and thinking about this topic. So thank you.
Just have a little thank you from the EQC, Wood from the Hood, in Minneapolis, right? So they do these, local
cool.
cutting
Thank
boards.
you.
Yes, yeah. Thanks for
Awesome.
being here.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.